Welcome to Shut In, Shut Out, Shut Up, Season 4, Intersectionality. I'm Fiona MacMillan. I have sound sensitivity and they cause massive spasms. For some reason, we're having problems with sound and echo this afternoon. So if you just bear with us, we'll try, and my technical colleagues will try and sort this out. I'm a disability advocate, practitioner, speaker and writer. I chair the Disability Advisory Group at St Martin in the Fields, and I'm a trustee of Inclusive Church. Since 2012, I've been helping to shape the annual Living Edge Conference on Disability and Theology, a partnership between St Martin in the Fields and Inclusive Church. It's a space for disabled and neurodivergent people to gather to resource each other and the church. These heart edge conversations have grown out of the annual conference and been shaped by disabled people's experience of the pandemic, of being shut in, increasingly isolated and restricted in our daily lives, of being shut out from society and church, and being shut up, our voices and experience excluded from conversations. In these seminar series, we hold space to explore these issues and ideas in the context of faith, theology, and church. Let me begin by outlining how today will work. Then I'll introduce the subject and our speakers, Molly Boot and Alex Clare-Young. If you'd like to, please do introduce yourselves in the chat. Perhaps say who you are and where you're joining from. Let's begin with access. Our BSL interpreter today is Emma Garner. If you're using BSL, you should be able to pin Emma's screen as well as the speakers. Automatic captions are also available if you click the CC icon at the bottom of your screen to display the captions. If you're using a screen reader and don't want to be disturbed by the chat, we'll save the chat and email it out afterwards. If you need any help with anything during this session, drop a note in the chat or directly to our Heart Edge hosts, Jonathan Evans or Joe Beecroft Mitchell. Timings. The first half of our session will be input from me and today's speakers. In the second half, we'll have a chance to share our responses, experience and ideas. Firstly, in small breakout groups for around 10 minutes, and then we'll come back together for plenary discussion and questions. We'll end by sharing some last thoughts, resources, and signposting to future events. This first half will be recorded. We'll be using speaker view, but do turn off your camera if you prefer. To ensure the quality of sound, please keep your microphone on mute unless you've been invited to speak. We also keep microphones on mute because some of us are sensitive to sound, including me, as I've just shown you. I have Tourette's and dystonia, and some sounds set off physical or verbal tics. These are involuntary movements, sounds, and words, including swear words. I'll do my best to hold them in, but it probably will make the session go more smoothly. Yet it's not always possible, much like a sneeze or a cough. And it's important that I come just as I am. That's what we're here for. So please come just as you are too. Over these 6 sessions, we're exploring the intersections of disability and neurodiversity with gender, mental health, sexuality, race, and poverty, and asking what are the key issues in the context of faith? What are our calls to the church? Last week, we began by defining our terms, and then Anne Memmott helped us to explore the intersections of disability and neurodiversity. She spoke of the pain of having parts of our identities rejected and the importance of church as a space of belonging. You can catch up with last week's session on the Heart Edge Facebook page and YouTube channel, where you'll also find previous series of Shut In, Shut Out, Shut Up. So I'm going to start again by defining our terms. Then I'll hand over to Molly and Alex to explore the intersectional experience of disability, neurodiversity and gender in the context of faith and church. In their strategy for gender justice, Christian Aid state, The term gender refers to socially constructed norms, roles, attributes, and opportunities associated with biological sex in a given context. But gender is not always fixed and can change over time and varies among different cultures, societies, ages, and classes. Gender is rooted in power relationships that shape choices and opportunities in every sphere of life and at every level, from household to global. Patriarchy is an overarching power structure that reproduces gendered social norms in a way that, for centuries, left women and girls disproportionately affected by poverty. In order to see change towards gender justice, empowering women and girls and redressing the power relationships between men and women is crucial. However, gender justice is not just a women's issue. Men can also be specifically disadvantaged and suffer from the damaging effects of social norms around what it means in different cultures to be a man. And transgender people and other minority gender groups are more often socially excluded, disadvantaged, and faced violence specifically because of gender identity. In their introduction to disability and gender, Ranvig Trausdottir writes of the parallels between disabled and gendered experience, of power relations, social exclusion, oppression, and other forms of marginalization, how dominant theories create, legitimize, and reconstruct negative images, where women's experience is excluded, distorted, and trivialized, while disabled people are portrayed as sick, tragic, unfortunate, or deviant, or more recently, heroes who overcome disability. Key concepts such as gender and disability are questioned and made problematic. In the UK, Caroline Waters, formerly board member of the Disability Advisory Group at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, speaks of the double whammy of being a disabled woman in the UK, because disabled women are hardest hit by cuts to public spending, the difficulties of living independently without being isolated in community, the increased risk of abuse in both home and society, the reduced likelihood of employment, a gendered disability pay gap, and inaccessible structures. She also writes that there is little hope of change until the government implements Section 14 of the Equality Act 2010, which focuses on combined discrimination or intersectional experience. Helen McCusher, writing about disability and gender, writes that disabled people have often been represented as without gender, as asexual creatures, as freaks of nature, monstrous, the other to the social norm. Thus, it may be assumed that for disabled people, gender has little bearing. Yet the image of disability may be intensified by justice, by gender. For women, a sense of intensified passivity and helplessness. For men, a corrupted masculinity generated by enforced dependence. Moreover, these images have real consequences in terms of education, employment, living arrangements, and personal relationships. Victimization and abuse that then in turn reinforce the images in the public sphere. The gendered experience of disability reveals sustained patterns of difference. In their strategy for gender justice, Christian Aid conclude how a person understands and expresses their gender identity and how their gender is perceived by others continues to be highly politicized, the source of secular and theological debates, and sometimes the basis of violent discrimination and social invisibility. Moving towards understanding gender as a spectrum allows us to go beyond redressing only power relationships between women and men, and enables us to develop a more inclusive approach where no one is left behind. Key to this is recognizing where gender intersects with other parts of experience, such as disability and neurodiversity, which we'll be doing today. I'm delighted to introduce today's guest speakers, Molly Boot and Alex Clare-Young, who will be helping us explore the intersection of disability, neurodiversity and gender, and outlining key issues in the context of faith and church. Molly is an autistic theologian, musician and ordinand at St Matthew's Bethnal Green. They write on mysticism, art, gender and sexuality, bringing medieval wisdom from modern life. Molly is a regular presenter for BBC Radio 4 Religion and Ethics and loves conducting, singing and playing the violin in their free time. Alex is a pioneer minister in the United Reformed Church with a particular call to working alongside those marginalised in church and society for social justice and equity for all. Alex's lived experience as a trans-masculine, non-binary person who is multiply neurodivergent and disabled inspires this call. Molly, Alex, welcome. Let's begin by hearing about your experience and ideas. Molly, perhaps we can start with you.
Thank you so much, Fiona, and thank you everyone for having me. It's brilliant to meet you in this strange online space, and I hope that you're well wherever you're coming from. So I was diagnosed with autism when I was 22, a couple of years ago, in the final year of my theology degree when I was training to be a Baptist minister. And like many autistic people, this was a huge relief for me. It helped me to understand and reinterpret some of my earliest and most formative experiences as a child. For example, that feeling of displacement at primary school, experiences of bullying and isolation, and some really positive experiences as well of the things that I was most excited by and obsessed with as a child. So I got into classical music from a very early age. I fell in love with playing my violin. Anything that I became interested in became an obsession very quickly, and that varied from neurology all the way to theology, which is my current thing, especially late medieval mysticism. I think it must have been exhausting for my parents, bless them. And there's a lot of variety across autistic communities around how we experience being autistic, and that can vary from being a gift in and of itself to bringing huge challenges and difficulties and everything in between those two poles. Some of those challenges, as you may well have heard from Anne last week, include anxiety, exhaustion, experiences of meltdowns and shutdowns, especially in intense social situations. For me, one of the most difficult social situations is a classroom context, especially when people are talking over each other and it can be difficult to follow the threads of things. That's shutdown central for me. One of the gifts of being autistic, though, is this ability and innate sense of how to colour outside the lines of social norms, which have never meant an awful lot to me. They haven't really made sense. I've always had the freedom, I think, from being autistic to question those norms. It's not that I don't care what people think, I do, but being autistic and feeling things as deeply as I do, experiencing things as deeply and being naturally analytical means that I've developed an unwavering commitment to unmasking. People talk about masking as an autistic person, behaving in ways that help you to fit in more easily to particular social contexts. But unmasking has been something that, especially since my diagnosis, I've been really committed to learning with help from therapy and from friends, how to be more fully myself. So part of this for me recently has meant that I've let my personal identity and understanding of myself to catch up with a long-standing academic, intellectual rejection of the idea of a gender binary. I have always thought, and was lucky enough to be encouraged by my parents to think, that gender is a spectrum, that it's something hugely diverse, that it's influenced by culture and society, as well as all sorts of different biological and neurological factors. And I found that I live better, that I am more myself, more unmasked, if I live in light of those beliefs, in light of those ideas. I found that I can choose how to perform my gender, how to see myself, how to present myself. I identify as a non-binary person. I still identify as a woman. Don't ask me to explain how those things naturally work themselves out. It varies on a day-to-day basis, depending on how I feel when I get up in the morning. And what I found is that this means that I don't have to sit in the middle of these poles of masculine and feminine as a non-binary person. I can kind of throw out the terms altogether. I'm just working out how to be more fully myself. Perhaps being autistic liberates me to do this work, because ever since I've been conscious, I've been so acutely aware of not quite fitting in, and I'm learning how to celebrate and live that not quite fitting more fully. So that's me.
Thank you, Molly. Learning how to celebrate not fitting in is a wonderful way to begin the conversation today. Thank you. Alex, perhaps you'd like to share something of your experience and ideas.
Thank you. I hope folks don't mind looking at a shared screen. I'm someone who thinks through images, sometimes more than words. So I'll be doing a bit of that today. On the screen is a cartoon style head and shoulders image of me, a white non-binary person with a black goatee, green eyes, and heavy framed glasses. Background of the image is purple and blue with stars and hearts. My name is Alex, and I'm multiply neurodivergent and also a transmasculine non-binary person. What that means in practice is that I'm autistic and dyspraxic. I transitioned towards male around 12 years ago, and that I now don't identify with the binary genders of male and female. Rather, I identify as non-binary, and I use the pronouns they, them, or just my name. I'm a minister in the United Reformed Church, and I'm about to begin a new ministry as a pioneer minister in Cambridge City Centre, just coming towards the end of my PhD research, where I'm exploring the identities, lived experiences, and insights of other trans and non-binary Christians. Several of the trans and non-binary folks who I've interviewed experience one or more aspects of neurodivergence or disability. As such, when I speak about gender diversity and neurodiversity, I'm mindful of the experiences of my research participants, my friends and my colleagues, as well as my own lived experiences. Coming onto the screen next is a neurodiversity symbol, which is an infinity loop in a rainbow colours, and a genderqueer symbol, which is a circle with a straight line ending in a star in purple, and they're intertwined. I've come to understand that my gender identity and my neurodivergence are inextricably interlinked, and that academics are also beginning to explore potential genetic components between neurodivergence and gender creativity. What I also understand is that where society sees disability, I often experience difference and at times gift. In particular, I credit being autistic and being non-binary with many of my most valued characteristics and abilities, some of which overlap with those that Molly was talking about earlier. So it'd be fascinating to talk more together about some of those. I feel that being autistic has gifted me with the ability to see beyond societal gender expectations and to just be myself, no matter how many barriers or expectations are put in my way. Personally, I identify with the term autigender, which has been coined by some autistic trans folks to describe the convergence between autism and not relating to gender norms in a typical way. So next on the screen, you'll see a set of scales that are uneven, symbolizing injustice. I also recognize that living in a world skewed in favor of those who are neurotypical and who are cis or not trans is something that I find disenabling to a really, really high degree. Life is sometimes near impossible, not at all because of who I am, but actually because of how systems and individuals see and treat me. or rather don't see and don't treat me. In responding to those difficulties, I'm helped and inspired by my understanding that rather than judging or negating us, Jesus supported individuals to confront normative society with their wonderfully diverse presence. Indeed, Jesus spoke out in support of eunuchs who were not exactly the same as trans people, but they were people who were excluded from religion because they didn't live within the sex and gender norms of their times. So that's a little bit about me and my ideas. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. That's great. I'm going to hand back to Molly now to begin us thinking about what are the key issues in gender, neurodiversity and disability in the context of faith? What are the key issues in gender in the context of faith? Thanks, Molly.
Thanks, Fiona, and thank you, Alex. I'm so excited to have more conversations today. This is great. So one of the issues that I thought of when Fiona asked me to do some thinking on this was the understanding of image bearing in the Christian faith, the understand that we bear the image of God. Folks who are hostile or who struggle with trans people, with non-binary people, with people who don't fit within gendered norms, often describe us as somehow denying the image of God, denying God's design for humans to be male or female. And I'm not about to go down a full biblical apologetics route through Genesis, because there are other people who have done that to death, and I don't think now is the time or the place for it. And I do acknowledge that I read the Bible very differently from some of my more conservative counterparts. But I find so much in the Bible, and starting in Genesis, that helps me to live better as an autistic non-binary person. So in Genesis, we read that humanity starts with Adam. This literally means dust, the dust that God breathes life into. The poetry of Genesis talks about Adam, this dust person, of Eve coming from Adam, and then all of humanity coming from Eve. And to me, that really doesn't offer a standard definition, a standard model of maleness and femaleness. The point of this story, this amazing poetry, isn't to explain how sex and gender should always work. It talks and bears witness to a story of hugely diverse creatures, all formed out of dust, working out how to be well with one another and with God. Part of the reason that I went in this dust creature direction is because we're in Lent. And on Ash Wednesday, we're reminded in some traditions that we are dust, and to dust we shall return. Now, this can be quite sobering, but I also think there's a radical sense of belonging that comes from that acknowledgement. That in all of the huge diversity of creation, we're all essentially made of the same stuff. That when we die, all of this stuff will be reunited in the love and the mercy of God. Bearing the image of God and living in hope of reconciliation to God and to one another means learning to celebrate and wonder at that infinite diversity, to wonder at the amazing things that God can do with dust, to quote the poet and UMC minister Jan Richardson. So no wonder our bodies and brains and all of the different parts of us are wired differently. God is so much more creative than we could possibly imagine. And I don't think that God really sets much store on our boxing and limiting of what God does in creating us as image-bearing dust creatures.
Thank you, Molly. I love it. I love that we're diverse creatures formed of dust. That is an image I'm going to take away and resonate with me for a long time. Thank you. Alex, would you like to outline for us some of the key issues in the context of faith? Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. So if you want to click forward 2 slides, I think, yeah, there we go. So I'll warn you all before I start, I think I'm talking a little longer in this section and then less in the last section. So on the screen is an exclamation mark in a circle. Both of them are pink. I could talk forever about issues, neurodiversity, about issues about neurodiversity and gender in relation to faith and to the church, but our time is short. So I'm going to focus on issues of conversion, normativity, stigma, and intersection. And I do occasionally have a stammer, so I apologize if I start speaking in an interesting way, but as Fiona says, it's good to bring our whole selves to this space. Let's have a look at the next slide. On the screen is a graphic of a white light bulb with a brain inside it. Conversely to some of the harmful faith focus on physical healing for disabilities, illnesses, and injuries, the anti-trans approach of many churches to gender prioritizes changing people's minds and insists that our bodies must be untouched by clinical interventions. In other words, churches and theologians often refuse to accept that trans bodies can be changed in transition, and instead they insist that our minds must be changed in conversion. Attempted conversion abuse, commonly known as conversion therapy, at the age of 15 affected me strongly in ways that interact with my neurodivergence. My social anxiety heightened the pressure I felt and made me feel unable to speak out about what was happening to me. My sensory differences, in particular emetophobia and eating differences, were used against me in order to try to change who I was. In this context of abuse, confusion, and contradiction, however, I've gradually come to celebrate my body and my mind, which is inextricably connected to my body, my neurotype, my ways of thinking, and my gender identity. So next on the screen, we'll see a white and purple. Well, no, we won't. I apparently didn't put that slide up. Apologies. So this slide, this is an image of kintsugi, which means that, sorry, kintsugi is a Japanese practice of filling the cracks in objects with gold. And so on the screen, you can see a circle of stone with cracks filled in gold, which is the art of kintsugi, celebrating scars as a beautiful part of an object or a person's story. The mistreatment of trans people often relies on a Cartesian split. The idea that our body and our minds are completely separate. This is logically completely untrue. Our brains are a physical part of our bodies, and who we are is informed by a complex mix of embodiment and experiences, ideas and understandings. It's impossible to fully separate the mental from the physical. Secondly, it is often assumed that binaries, including the gender binary of male or female, the neurotype binary of intelligent or unintelligent, and the embodied binary of able or disabled, are natural. This is a particular problem within the church, as binaries in Genesis are often read as literal, rather than as liturgical or literary device that they clearly are. We need to teach that non-binary identities, multiple intelligences, because no one is unintelligent, and complex bodies are natural. Binaries are not the only way, and they do untold damage. The same Cartesian split and binaries that are used to undermine trans folks are also used to dismiss neurodivergence. Both neurodivergence and gender creativity defy simple binaries and are related to the whole body, including the mind. So let's move to normativity and stigma. Churches and communities of faith often reinforce normativity by presenting the perfect, beautiful, slim, well, typically abled and neurotypical person not only as the norm, but also as the preference. Not only is this ideal unrealistic, it's completely contradictory. Christians supposedly follow a Christ who keeps their scars after resurrection. This suggests that we're called towards perfect imperfection, to quote a song. That is in our differences and our scars that we image God. We're not all supposed to be the same. The same norms and stigmas that are used against neurodivergent people are used against trans people. Control of what we do with our bodies is a clear element of both. When I'm stared at for stimming, my body is questioned just as when people query what genitalia I have, which happens more often than you might think. When people refuse to accept that I'm autistic because I'm not congruent with their stereotypes. It feels similar to when people refuse to use my they, them pronouns because they're not congruent with their understandings. I often feel like pointing out that Jesus was not normative. Jesus transitioned from God to human, from human to God, and the body of Christ, as Elizabeth Stewart notes, is stretched. It's a body that includes all genders and neurotypes. So God is inherently neurodiverse and non-binary. Next on the screen are that neurodiversity symbol and genderqueer symbol intertwined once more. As I mentioned in my introduction, my neurodivergence and my gender identity are inextricably linked. This is something that I feel intuitively and which there's developing academic consensus on. There's more information and conversation about the intersections between trans identities and neurodivergence than regarding physical disability, but this is a developing field. And I also live with a physical disability that is often considered to be linked to trans identities and neurodivergence. I'm particularly interested in the links between autism and trans identities, which seem to lead to raise a chicken egg question. Am I autistic because I'm trans, or trans because I'm autistic? Did my gender incongruence and dysphoria as a child cause cognitive dissonance that's expressed in social processing and sensory differences? Or do those differences themselves mean that I do not give more weight than is necessary to social norms about gender and sexuality? Perhaps neither. Perhaps it doesn't matter. To me, both my transness and my neurodivergence are intrinsic parts of my queer identity, which for me means thinking, looking, and living outside of, as well as explicitly challenging, any socially dictated norm. Thank you.
Amen. Alex, I don't know if you could see quite how much nodding there was happening during your exceptional presentation and slides there. So thank you very much indeed for that powerful, explosive introduction to some of the key issues in church or in faith. So much overlap between the experience of trans people and LGBT people with conversion therapy and autistic people with ABA, and the same kind of roots of psychological reasons for why you should change your mind because your mind is a broken one or your mind is a deviant one. And it's brilliant to have both of you bringing some of that experience today. Molly, perhaps you could help us move on to some of the things that we could do. What are the ways that church could change? What are the ways that there's the starting points for making things better?
One of my calls to the church is for people to challenge a harmful rhetoric that being gender non-conforming is somehow being unfaithful to God or unfaithful to our inherent image bearing. In fact, gender diversity only adds to our reflecting of the image of a God who, as Alex so eloquently puts, is themselves neurodiverse, is themselves gender diverse, is beyond our ability to describe, define, or depict. And the same goes for neurodiversity. Autism isn't somehow an illness or a defect. No disability, no neurodiversity mars the image of God in us. We reflect and reveal God's character differently, and that is a gift. This doesn't mean that disabled and neurodiverse people or gender non-conforming people do not suffer. I experience fatigue, meltdowns, shutdowns, anxiety, and trauma, which are all exacerbated by being autistic. And we have a responsibility to support our neurodiverse kin as we seek to support and flourish in the world and in the church. In a recent book, Autistic Thinking in the Life of the Church by Stuart Rapley, him and Grant McCaskill point out that what is good for autistic people in the church is good for all of us. Safe, quiet breakout space for moments of overwhelm, room for rigorous learning and questioning, and a healthy sense of experiencing the mystery of God is for all of us. It's often said that autistic people can't do ambiguity or nuance, and that just isn't true. I love the mystical and experiential and earthy elements of our faith. I just need some time and space and support to be able to relax into those contemplative and transcendent threads of Christianity. Ritual and routine are hugely helpful in this respect, and this is a part of my having found a home in an Anglo-Catholic tradition in the church, which I found to be a really good container for being able to grapple with the mystery of God. I think I'm going to leave it there and pass over to Alex. I do have more stuff that I could say on gender, but I think we'll have all sorts of conversation in the plenary. So
brilliant, thank you, Molly. Again, I don't know if you could see quite how much excitement there was at what you were saying there around the room. Alex, could you help us think about what are the calls to the church? What are the challenges for the church? What differences? What could we do to make a difference?
Absolutely. So you've only got one slide this time, so it's fairly straightforward. This is a slide of a purple or pink. Some people seem to disagree on the color of this hammer. So on the screen, you can see a hammer that's either purple or pink. And you can also see the three calls that I'm about to make of the church. My main calls to both church and society is to say that it's time to start to deconstruct the norms that we as church have asserted around both gender and neurotypes. I think it's vital that the church owns its culpability here. Overly literalistic readings of scripture are at the root of the societal norms which harm a great many people. And we're still living with the reality that the vast majority of churches are not at all accessible to trans, non-binary, and or neurodivergent people. Given that there are intersections between neurodivergence and trans and non-binary identities, these intersections should be considered when taking steps towards inclusion, or better still, affirmation. A lot of this has to do with the physicality of buildings and spaces. We need to move towards increasing accessible toilets, non-gendered dorms or private sleeping spaces, and other spaces and groups that are radically accessible. Churches should also be aware that if they are anti-trans or anti-LGBTQ+ more generally, they are probably more likely to exclude neurodivergent and disabled people too, given the intersections that have been shown to exist. There are, of course, also the other intersections that have been talked about in this series. Churches that exclude LGBTQ+ people don't only exclude us, they further the exclusion of all minoritized and oppressed people. The church needs to think and work at the intersections if it's to grow towards genuine welcome, expansive justice, and nuanced, safe growth. Finally, I think it's time for both churches and theologians to recognize the gifts of non-binary and neurodivergent people rather than problematizing us. We're all different, of course, but my PhD interview participants showed in particular great skill at managing complexity. They were able to use statements like, I am a father and a grandmother. I am a father and a grandmother, with no problem. They were able to accept supposed contradictions and to be skilled at explaining the intersections between complex identities, experiences, and ideas to others, even those who would harm them. These are gifts that I think the church and society sorely needs right now. It's my belief that ecclesial problems often stem from a tendency to simplify and polarize. Perhaps trans and non-binary people can help the church complexify and diversify those hot topic conversations. Let's hope so. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. There are just so many questions. I could hear that from both you and Molly. There are so many things that the church could be doing, and there are so many challenges for us to call to the church, to challenge the church about its beliefs and its practice and its harmful theologies. I think we're going to, we're just coming up to the time when we're going to move into small groups. So huge thanks to Molly and to Alex for getting us going with some really challenging and really exciting ideas. I think we're going to have a lot that we want to share with one another. We're going to spend about 10 minutes now in small groups, a short time in small groups of like 3 or 4 people. It's a chance to reflect and to respond together, to perhaps share something of our own experience and ideas. So there's a chance to share something of our own identities, respond to what we've heard, what shocked or surprised us, what's encouraged us, and what might we do differently, what action might we take, or what might be called to the church. I'll pop these thoughts about what you might like to consider in the chat, so you'll have those when you go into your groups. But we're going to spend about 10 minutes in groups, just maybe 10-12 minutes in groups, to have a chance to talk to one another. And then we'll come back together into a plenary and spend another 20 minutes or so with a chance to ask some of these questions which have come up during the conversation today, and to share something of our own experience. So Jonathan, are we ready to go into groups? We are. So if you hit join in the invitation in front of you, and we'll see you back here in a few minutes. Thank you. I'm going to come back to Molly and Alex to share their last thoughts with us today. Then I'm going to wrap up and sign to next week. We'd love to hear what you'd like to challenge us with, or encourage us with, or ask us to remember from today's conversation. Perhaps we could start with Molly. What's your last thought for us today?
I haven't pre-thought this, so we'll see what happens. I think my last thought would be that each of us are places of revelation. We reveal God's character, we reveal God's diversity in an infinite number of ways. And it is my hope and my prayer that our different churches will get better at perceiving that. That is, I'm still a charismatic at heart. That is a gift of the Spirit to be able to perceive God in unexpected places and in the full diversity of God's creation. And so each of you gathered here bear something of God, and each of the people that you will encounter this week and every week bear something of the image of God. And wouldn't it be amazing if the places where we work and live and worship would get better at recognizing and not just welcoming, because that's the lowest bar, but celebrating that. And that's what I think all of us here continue to work and hope and pray for.
Brilliant, thank you, Molly. Alex, what's your last thought for us today?
Amen to that. I often, when I talk about these things, people say, well, of course you're welcome, of course we accept you, you're human after all. And I guess I want to come back at that as a final thought and say, let's celebrate diversity. Let's not erase it. Yeah, we're all human. But I also celebrate the particularities of my identity. I'm trans, I'm non-binary, I'm neurodivergent, and I'm learning to love those things. So I want to say, yes, let's help the church to be more radically welcoming. But first, let's actually radically welcome our full, authentic selves in that kind of love of ourselves that I think Molly was pointing towards too, because we're all awesome and we're all made in God's image. So let's party with it, you know?
Let's party with it. Thank you, Alex. For those wanting to understand more and to create change, I commend to you the resources we put together for today and those recommended in the chat. Heart Edge colleagues have kindly dropped these into the chat, and these resources will also be available on the Heart Edge website. Alex has offered books, papers, blogs, and web resources on transgender experience, theology, faith, and justice. For background reading, I've included some papers on disability and gender. For a model to explore, I've offered Christian Aid strategy for gender justice, which has an intersectional and inclusive approach, as well as links to organisations working in church in disability and gender, Inclusive Church, Watch, and Open Table. Today's conversation has explored experience and opened ideas. Thanks so much again to Molly and to Alex for your thought-provoking, challenging and encouraging ideas. Thanks to Jonathan and Joe for hosting the Zoom and holding the space today. Thank you to everyone for what you brought and shared today in the chat, in the groups and in the plenary session. Thanks to Heart Edge for offering a platform where disabled and neurodivergent people can have more honest conversations about disability, neurodiversity, theology and practice. This series is only one offering from Heart Edge as part of their online festival of theology, Humbler Church, Bigger God. Heart Edge are a growing international and ecumenical network and movement for change in the church through commerce, culture, congregation and compassion. You can read more about Heart Edge or sign up for their mailing, catch up with previous learning and register for future events via their websites, details in the chat. Next week, we'll be back exploring disability, neurodiversity and mental health with Kate Harford and Rachel Noel. Kate Harford is a priest of the Metropolitan Community Churches, University Chaplain and Pastoral Care Lead at Oxford Brookes University. Based on her own lived experience, Kate has a particular interest in queer theology and the faith experiences and expressions of neurodivergent people and those who live with mental illness. She lives with her wife and cat in Oxford and enjoys knitting, playing the flute and disrupting the cis-heteropatriarchal systems. Rachel Noel is known locally as the Pink Vicar. She's priest in charge of St Mark's Church, Pennington, a Heart Edge church in the Diocese of Winchester. Creative, colourful, enthusiastic, autistic, ADHD, bipolar and vulnerable to COVID, Rachel is passionate about diversity and inclusion. She's a member of the community of Hope Weavers. We look forward to hearing from them both. This just about wraps it up for today. Thank you again to Molly, to Alex and to all of you. And last words from Lila Watson, Australian Aboriginal elder. If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Amen. Thank you again. Hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.